The smoker hummed on the balcony, venting the sweet scent of hickory into the cooling Wednesday air. I was shredding cheddar when my phone buzzed against the granite. My fiancée texted, "Don't freak out, but I'm sharing a hotel room with my coworker tonight. It's totally professional." My reply was simple, "Great. Then you don't need my place anymore." I set the phone face down. The silence in the condo suddenly felt heavy and permanent. The pulled pork nachos remained unmade on the counter. I moved with a cold, mechanical precision that surprised me. Every drawer I opened revealed a different layer of her calculated presence. I grabbed a stack of heavy moving boxes from the garage. The cardboard scraped against the hardwood floor, a harsh sound in the quiet room. I didn't feel the heat of anger. I felt the weight of 29 months of misplaced trust finally lifting. I started with her closet, pulling down dresses like I was clearing out a stranger's house. The bathroom felt like a crime scene. I found the expensive curling iron she once claimed my sister had stolen. It was tucked behind the toilet tank, thick with dust and gray lint. She had let me fight with my family for months over a lie. I dropped it into a duffel bag filled with her half-used lotions and acrylic towers. Every bottle I packed was another piece of evidence. I realized I was not just moving her out, I was erasing a ghost. By 9:30, the living room looked like a staging area for an elite logistics firm. I called the property manager to confirm her lack of residency. He validated the truth in minutes. She had no lease and no legal claim to my front door. I loaded the last box into my truck bed under the dim streetlights. My phone vibrated 6 times in my pocket, but I didn't check it. I knew the cycle of denial had already begun. She was losing her grip. The drive to the Westin was meditative and dark. I pushed a luggage cart through the lobby, my boots clicking on the polished marble. Marianne, the night clerk, watched me with a tired, knowing expression. I didn't make a scene or demand a room number. I simply left the stack of boxes and the garment bag by the desk. I tipped the porter $20 to call her room. I wanted her to know her life had arrived before she even woke up. Back home, the locksmith was already working on the deadbolt. The metallic rasp of the file felt like a clean break. I walked through the empty rooms and found my old iPad wedged between the sofa cushions. It was still synced to her messages. 4 months of Brennan's mocking laughter stared back at me in blue bubbles. They thought I was too stupid to ever look. I took a slow sip of water and started saving every single screenshot for the morning. The iPad screen flickered with a light that felt clinical. I scrolled through the filth they shared while I paid for her meals. Brennan had sent a photo of a luxury watch, asking if I was too poor to notice her new jewelry. Senna replied with a laughing emoji and a comment about my boring woodworking. The betrayal was a physical weight in my chest. I realized then that I wasn't mourning a woman. I was mourning a lie. I saved every digital thread to 3 separate cloud accounts. My hands remained steady as I worked through the logs. The messages dated back to our summer trip to the lake. While I was grilling dinner, she was planning trysts in the city. The screenshots were timestamps of my own blindness. I finished the backup and performed a hard factory reset on the device. The glass felt cold and slick. Now, she had no digital tether left to me. At 6 in the morning, the phone vibrating on the nightstand sounded like a jackhammer. I ignored the first 10 calls while I brewed a fresh pot of coffee. The kitchen felt strangely large and quiet without her constant complaints. She finally left a voicemail that sounded like a trapped animal. Her voice was thin and high, stripped of its usual confidence. She claimed she was freezing outside. I checked the security camera. She was standing there alone. I opened the door just as she raised her fist to knock. Senna looked smaller in the morning light, her makeup smeared into gray hollows. She tried to push past me into the foyer. I blocked the path with a single, firm step. She started to cry, but the tears didn't reach her eyes. It was a practiced performance I had seen many times before. She demanded to know why her boxes were at the hotel. I didn't blink once. You chose the Westin, I said quietly. I just finalized the reservation. Her face twisted into a mask of pure rage. She screamed that I was a narcissist and a monster. She claimed she would call the police to report an illegal eviction. I leaned against the doorframe and crossed my arms. I reminded her that her license still listed her mother's suburban address. She had never signed the lease. The realization hit her like a physical blow to the stomach. A black sedan pulled into the driveway, and a man I recognized stepped out. It was Brennan, looking exactly like his polished Instagram photos. He didn't look heroic, he looked nervous and out of place. He tried to tell me to be reasonable and calm. I pulled out my phone and held it up. I asked him how Mallory would feel about his creative expense reports. His face went pale. The power in the driveway shifted in a single heartbeat. Senna turned on him, her desperation finally curdling into panic. She realized I wasn't the only one she had lied to. Brennan backed away toward his car, leaving her standing on the pavement. He wasn't going to be her savior today. I stepped back inside and gripped the new brass keys. I told them both to stay off my property or face the evidence. As I closed the door, I saw a police cruiser turn the corner. The officer stepped out of the cruiser with a heavy, practiced sigh. Senna instantly transformed, her face crumbling into a masterpiece of manufactured grief. She pointed a shaking finger at my front door and claimed I had stolen her life. The officer looked from her smeared mascara to my calm, folded arms. I didn't wait for him to ask the first question. I handed him my phone with the hotel text displayed. The law was a cold, binary machine. He read the words while Senna continued her frantic sobbing in the driveway. Brennan stood by his sedan, looking like he wanted to vanish into the pavement. The officer asked for her ID, and she hesitated for a long second. She finally pulled a license from her purse that confirmed my earlier statement. It listed her mother's address across town. She had no lease and no utility bills in her name. The officer's sympathy vanished in an instant. "This is a civil matter, ma'am," he said, handing back her card. Senna tried to argue about tenant rights and mail delivery. He didn't care about her Amazon packages or her emotional state. He told her to contact a lawyer and move her car from the fire lane. Bren saw his chance and retreated into his driver's seat without a word. Senna watched him leave, her mouth hanging open in shock. Her savior was a coward after all. I went back inside and locked the door against the morning chill. The silence of the condo felt like a reward for my patience. I made a final check of the rooms to ensure nothing remained. I found a single earring under the nightstand and tossed it in the trash. It was a cheap piece of glass she had bought with my money. I realized I was finally breathing without a weight on my chest. Then, my laptop chimed loudly. The Facebook notification was a dissertation-length post written by Senna's sister. It painted me as a narcissist who had discarded a loyal woman in the snow. Her friends were already piling on with comments of outrage and digital fire. They called for my head and my job. I sat at the table and watched the lies spread like a virus. It was a coordinated strike designed to ruin my reputation. I opened my folder of saved screenshots. I didn't write a long response or defend my character to strangers. I simply posted the original, professional, hotel text as a direct reply to her post. I added the timestamped messages of her mocking my woodworking while she was with Brennan. The digital roar stopped almost instantly. People began deleting their comments within minutes. The tide was turning faster than she could delete the evidence. Truth was a fire that required no fuel from me. The doorbell rang again, but it wasn't the police or a crying ex. It was a courier holding a legal envelope and a small, heavy box. I signed the electronic pad and stepped back into the kitchen. Inside the box was the grandmother's ring I had demanded she return via her sister. It was wrapped in a torn napkin with a final, bitter note. I held the diamond to the light. It was chipped at the very edge. I stared at the chipped diamond sitting in the center of my palm. The damage was small, but the intent behind it felt enormous. She had tried to break the only thing of value I asked back. It was a petty, final act of a woman who had lost her leverage. I placed the ring in a velvet box and shoved it into the safe. My objective was clear now. I needed to finish this before she grew bolder. The coffee had gone cold in the pot while I watched the screen. My phone chimed with a message from an unknown number. It was Mallory, Brennan's girlfriend, asking to meet at a nearby park. She sounded hollow and frantic in the text. I grabbed my keys and headed toward the door. The hallway smelled of fresh paint and new metal. I felt like a stranger in my own home. Someone was watching from a car outside. Mallory was sitting on a bench near the frozen pond when I arrived. Her eyes were red and her hands were buried deep in her pockets. She didn't look up when I sat down. She told me Brennan had tried to blame everything on Senna's persistence. He claimed she was the one who pushed for the room. I didn't say anything at first. I just handed her the printouts of the messages from the forgotten iPad. She read the pages while the wind whipped her hair across her face. Her breathing hitched when she saw the photos they had shared. They had mocked our future together while we were planning weddings. The power balance shifted as she realized she wasn't just a victim. She was a witness to his professional fraud. She looked at me with a sudden, sharp clarity. She told me Brennan had been skimming from the company travel fund. I drove back to the condo with a new sense of purpose. The investigation into the hotel stays was about to become much more serious. I sent a short email to the HR director at their firm. I included the dates and the creative accounting Brennan had mentioned in his texts. This was no longer just about a broken engagement. It was about a career ending in disgrace. My phone began to glow with a dozen new alerts. Senna was waiting by my garage when I pulled into the driveway. She looked desperate and held a manila folder against her chest. She claimed she had proof of our domestic partnership. She wanted half the value of the condo to go away quietly. I laughed as I stepped out of the truck. I told her the HR department was already reviewing her expenses. Her face turned a sickly shade of white in the fading light. She dropped the folder and started to back away from me. The papers scattered across the concrete, revealing nothing but old utility bills. She had been bluffing until the very end. I walked past her without a word and entered the garage. As the heavy door slid shut, I noticed a strange car parked down the block. A man was taking photos of my house from the driver's seat. He wasn't working for Senna. I watched the man in the sedan through the slats of the garage door. He wasn't some hired thug or a jilted coworker. He looked like a professional investigator, clipboard resting on his dashboard. I retreated into the house and checked my security cameras. Senna was gone, but her folder remained on the pavement like a dead bird. I realized the company wasn't just investigating expenses. They were building a legal case against everyone involved. My involvement was suddenly a liability I hadn't considered. I spent the next hour scrubbing my digital footprint while the sun dipped lower. My objective was simply total detachment from the coming fallout. I deactivated my old accounts and wiped the last shared cloud folder. The silence in the kitchen felt heavy with the scent of stale hickory. My phone buzzed with a message from Mallory. She warned me that Brennan was trying to name me as a co-conspirator in his fraud. He claimed I knew about the fund misuse for years. The pressure tightened in my throat like a physical grip. I pulled up the iPad backup and searched for any mention of my name in their schemes. I found the turning point in a thread from October. Brennan had told Senna he would use my woodworking business to launder the extra cash. She had agreed, sending him my tax ID number without my knowledge. My blood went cold at the sight of the numbers. She hadn't just cheated on me, she had framed me. I grabbed my jacket and headed back to the garage with a new, frantic energy. I needed to find that folder she had dropped on the driveway earlier. I hit the door opener and stepped out into the biting evening air. The papers were still there, fluttering against the concrete. I gathered them up and found a bank statement I hadn't seen before. It was a joint account opened in my name and Brennan's. The signature on the bottom was a perfect forgery of mine. The man in the sedan finally stepped out and approached me with a steady gait. He flashed a badge from a private firm hired by the corporate board. He asked if I was Logan and if I had any records of the October transactions. I handed him the folder of forged documents and the iPad screenshots. He looked through them with a grim, practiced eye. The power shifted as he realized I was the primary victim of their financial theater. "They used you as a shield," he said, tapping the forged signature. He told me that Senna had already tried to blame the laundered money on my hobbies. She had painted me as the mastermind during her HR interview that afternoon. I felt a sharp, crystalline anger replace my fear. I told him everything about the hotel text and the hidden iPad. He recorded my statement while the wind howled around us. Senna's desperate plan was finally crumbling under the weight of her own lies. He thanked me for the cooperation and walked back to his car with the folder. I felt a strange sense of finality as his taillights vanished down the street. I went back inside and locked the door for the last time that night. I checked the safe to ensure the chipped ring was still there. As I turned away, a new notification appeared on my screen. It was a formal termination notice for Senna. She had also been charged with felony identity theft. The felony charge felt like a cold blade of justice cutting through the remaining fog. I sat in my darkened office, the only light coming from the blue glow of my monitors. My primary objective was now defensive. I had to prove my woodwork business was a legitimate craft, not a front for Brennan's greed. I spent hours pulling every receipt, every invoice, and every photo of my finished cedar tables. I needed to build a wall of paper between my life and her crimes. Each file felt like a heavy stone. By 2 a.m, the evidence was stacked in neat piles across the floor. The silence was broken by a frantic pounding on my front door. I checked the camera and saw Senna's mother, her face twisted with a frantic, desperate energy. She wasn't crying anymore. She was shouting about how I had ruined her daughter's future over a simple misunderstanding. She demanded I retract my statement to the private investigator immediately. She claimed blood was thicker than pride. I didn't open the door. I just watched her through the digital lens. The pressure intensified when she pulled a brick from my garden bed and held it high. I grabbed my phone and dialed the police. My voice steady despite the adrenaline. I told the operator there was a trespasser threatening my property with a weapon. The power dynamic shifted when the mother realized I wasn't going to argue. I was simply going to record her downfall. She dropped the brick and spat at the camera before retreating into the shadows of the street. She left behind a deep, jagged scratch on the mahogany door. I went back to my desk, my hands finally beginning to shake from the lingering stress. I realized I had been living in a state of constant war for days. I opened a final folder on the iPad and found a voice memo. It was recorded 3 weeks ago during a late-night dinner I wasn't invited to. Senna and Brennan were discussing how they would spend the laundered money. They talked about buying a beach house while I worked myself into the ground. Their laughter was a sharp, grating sound that filled the room. The mid-scene turn came when I heard my own name mentioned in the recording. Brennan whispered that he had already moved $40,000 into the joint account. My heart stopped as I realized the scale of the theft. This wasn't just creative accounting. It was a massive embezzlement scheme that pointed directly at my bank records. I needed to find where they had hidden the actual cash. I searched my woodworking shop in the garage, tearing through the sawdust and timber. I found a false bottom in a shipping crate. Inside the crate sat a thick, plastic-wrapped bundle of $100 bills. My breath hitched as I realized the danger I was in. Having this cash in my house was enough to send me to prison. I didn't touch the money with my bare hands. I used a pair of workshop gloves to slide it into a clean bag. The obstacle was no longer just Senna. It was the entire legal system that might view me as the vault. I needed to turn this over to the investigator before morning. I called the private investigator at 3:30 and told him about the crate in the garage. He sounded surprised by the speed of the discovery. He promised to meet me at a neutral location in 20 minutes. I drove my truck through the empty city streets, the bag of cash sitting on the passenger seat. Every set of headlights behind me felt like a threat. I felt like a criminal carrying a bomb. I reached the diner and saw his sedan parked under a flickering yellow light. We sat in a back booth while he inspected the plastic, wrapped bundles with a flashlight. He told me this was the missing piece of the board's audit. He confirmed that Senna had tried to access the garage while I was at work earlier. She wasn't looking for clothes. She was looking for the money she had stolen. The realization that she had tried to set me up even after the breakup was a final, bitter pill. I signed the chain of custody form. I was finally free of the physical evidence. As I walked back to my truck, my phone buzzed with an email from my bank. Someone had tried to change the password on my primary savings account 3 times in the last hour. I knew it was Senna, clawing at whatever she could reach before the cage closed. I realized then that she wouldn't stop until she was physically restrained. I drove home and saw a familiar car parked in my driveway. It wasn't the police or the mother. It was Mallory, and she looked terrified. Mallory gripped the steering wheel so tight her knuckles were white stones. I approached her window cautiously, the gravel crunching under my boots, surprised to see her back so soon after our meeting. She told me Brennan had snapped. He had destroyed their apartment looking for the missing cash I just gave to the investigator. He knew the audit was closing in on his neck. Mallory had seen him grab a spare key he stole from Senna's purse weeks ago. He was coming here to finish what they started. The night felt suddenly much colder than before. I ushered her inside and locked the door with a heavy thud. My primary objective was to keep her safe while we waited for the police. I checked the monitors and saw a shadow move near the back balcony. Brennan didn't care about subtlety anymore. He was a man with nothing left to lose but his freedom. I grabbed a heavy oak table leg from my workshop corner. It felt solid and real in my hand. Mallory hid in the pantry, her breathing loud and ragged. The glass in the kitchen door shattered with a high, crystalline ring. Brennan stepped through the shards, his expensive suit jacket torn and stained. He didn't look like a corporate climber anymore. He looked like a cornered predator. He demanded the money from the crate, his eyes darting around the room. I stood my ground near the hallway, the table leg held low. I told him the cash was already in the hands of the law. His face twisted into a mask of pure, unadulterated hatred. "You think you're so smart," he spat, stepping over the broken glass. He claimed Senna had planned to poison me slowly with some chemicals from my shop. The mid-scene turn hit me like a physical punch to the ribs. I thought about the strange, bitter taste in my coffee for the last month, realizing why my energy had been flagging. I had ignored the headaches and the fatigue as simple stress. She hadn't just framed me for theft. She had been trying to kill me. My grip on the wood tightened until my palm burned. Brennan lunged forward, but he was clumsy and fueled by panic. I swung the oak leg, catching him hard across the shoulder. He hit the floor with a heavy groan, his breath escaping in a sharp wheeze. I didn't give him a chance to recover or reach for a weapon. I pinned him down and used a length of paracord from my workbench to bind his hands. He started to sob, a pathetic sound in the wreckage of my kitchen. The corporate mask had finally dissolved completely. The police arrived 5 minutes later, their sirens painting the walls in blue and red. They found Mallory shaking in the pantry and Brennan bound on the floor. I handed the lead officer the small vial of clear liquid I found in the spice rack. It was hidden behind the paprika, exactly where Brennan said she kept the antifreeze solution. The officer bagged it carefully, his face grim under the strobe lights. The investigation had just expanded into attempted murder. I felt a strange, hollow sense of relief. They took my statement while the forensics team dusted the kitchen for prints. I watched them lead Brennan away in handcuffs, his head bowed against the wind. Mallory decided to stay with her sister for the night. She thanked me for the truth, even though it had destroyed her world. I stood in the center of my home, surrounded by broken glass and shattered trust. The condo felt like a fortress that had finally held its ground. I was exhausted down to my very marrow. The next morning, the news of the arrests broke across the local channels. Senna had been picked up at a bus station, trying to leave the state. She was charged with embezzlement, identity theft, and attempted homicide. Her mother was also detained for questioning regarding the threats at my door. The social media campaign against me had turned into a public apology from her former friends. They were horrified by the monster they had defended. I deleted my accounts and turned off the television. I spent the weekend repairing the kitchen door and cleaning the glass. Each stroke of the broom felt like a necessary ritual of purification. I threw away every spice, every coffee bean, and every dish she had ever touched. The condo was returning to its original state, but I was different now. I was no longer the man who compromised his soul for a lie. I was a survivor who knew the true cost of peace. I sat on the balcony and watched the sun rise. The property manager called to inform me that the board was dropping all inquiries. My cooperation had saved the company millions in potential losses. They offered a settlement for the damages to my home and my business reputation, officially clearing my woodworking shop of any criminal involvement. I accepted the offer without negotiation and put it into a new savings account. As I hung up, I noticed a small, white envelope tucked under my mat. It wasn't a threat or a legal notice. It was a handwritten note from someone named Vera. Vera was a friend of a friend who had seen the news. Her note was simple and offered a coffee without the drama of my past life. I met her 3 days later at a small shop near the docks. The salt air felt fresh and honest compared to the hospital smell of my condo. We didn't talk about the trial or the poison. She asked about the grain of the oak table I was building. It was the first real question I had answered in years. The transition back to normalcy felt like walking on a broken leg. Senna sent a letter from jail through her legal counsel. She begged me to testify that the poison was for a woodworking project. She promised to reveal where she hid the rest of the embezzled funds. I burned the paper in the sink without finishing the second page. I didn't need her money or her secrets anymore. I was building a new life out of solid, untreated timber. My focus was on the future. 6 months later, the trial concluded with a series of guilty pleas. Brennan took a deal to testify against Senna in exchange for a lighter sentence. She was sentenced to 10 years for the murder attempt alone. I stood in the back of the courtroom and watched them lead her away. She looked at me with a hollow, haunting desperation. I felt nothing but a distant sense of pity. The woman I loved had never really existed. She was just a ghost made of greed. Vera helped me pick out a rescue dog that winter. He was a scruffy mutt named Copper with one floppy ear and a loud bark. He filled the silent corners of the condo with a chaotic, joyful energy. My woodworking shop was busy again with legitimate orders. I stopped looking at the security cameras every hour. The scratches on the mahogany door were sanded smooth and vanished under a fresh coat of oil. Life was quiet. I finally felt safe in my own skin. We were hiking up the ridge when I finally pulled out the velvet box. The chipped diamond from my grandmother's ring had been replaced with a clear, perfect sapphire. I didn't give a grand speech about forever or destiny. I simply asked if she wanted to build something permanent with me. Vera laughed and pulled me into a kiss that tasted like cold mountain air. Copper barked at a squirrel in the brush. It was a simple moment. I realized that stability was not a weakness. It was my greatest strength. The evening sun dipped behind the pines as we walked back to the truck. My phone buzzed in my pocket, but I didn't reach for it. I knew it wasn't a threat or a lie. It was just the world moving on without me. We drove home with the windows down and the heater on high. I looked in the mirror and saw a man who had survived the fire. I was finally home. Even when the engine made a sharp, metallic sound and died, I just laughed. For the first time in my life, I knew a broken machine was a problem I could actually fix.